Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. I've spent enough time in the Appalachian Mountains to know they don't need ghosts to be intimidating. The silence out there is different. It settles over everything. The trees, the valleys, even your own thoughts. Most people who visit only ever see the hiking trails, the overlooks, the campsites. They don't see the miles of untouched forest hidden beyond them. That's where I worked. My name's Ethan. About 4 years ago, I was working as a forestry survey technician for the state, and it wasn't an exciting job. Most days, I'd park the truck, sling a GPS over my shoulder, and spend 8 or 9 hours walking through the woods. I'd mark trees, record coordinates, photograph erosion, and note anything that might affect future hiking trails. It was quiet work, exactly the kind of job I wanted. For one assignment, I was sent to survey a section of forest so remote that driving back and forth every day didn't make sense. Instead, the Forestry Service gave me access to one of their old field cabins. I'd be there for 5 days, completely alone. The cabin had probably been built sometime in the 70s. It wasn't much to look at. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a wood-burning stove, a covered porch that sagged just enough to make you wonder how many winters it had survived. There was no electricity, no running water, just a rainwater tank, a battery-powered lantern, and an old radio that connected to the ranger station if the weather cooperated. No mobile reception either. Once the truck disappeared down the track, that was it. You were on your own. The nearest town was over an hour away. The ranger station was closer, but still far enough that if something went wrong, nobody was getting there quickly. I arrived just after lunch on a Monday, unlocked the cabin, dropped my gear inside, then spent the afternoon checking my equipment for the week ahead. GPS camera, survey markers, maps, notebook, everything exactly where it should be. Outside, the mountains stretched further than I could see, layer after layer of forest disappearing into a blue autumn haze. It was beautiful. The kind of place that reminded you how small you really were. That evening, I lit the stove, heated a can of soup, and sat on the porch while the sun disappeared behind the ridgeline. The forest slowly changed. The birds stopped calling. The wind settled. Before long, there was almost no sound at all. People think silence is relaxing. Out there, it isn't. Silence has a way of making every little noise seem important. A twig snapping, leaves moving. The cabin settling as the temperature dropped. I'd stayed in places like that before, so none of it bothered me. By 10 o'clock, I was in bed. The old wall clock ticked steadily above the bedroom door. I remember checking it one last time before turning off the lantern. 10:03 p.m. I fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I covered nearly 10 miles on foot. The survey was going well. By sunset, I was exhausted. I cooked dinner, updated my notes, checked in with the ranger station over the radio. Everything normal, nothing unusual to report. Looking back, that's probably the last normal evening I had in that cabin, because sometime after I'd fallen asleep, something woke me. At first, I couldn't work out what it was. I lay there in the darkness, listening. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. The first thing I did was look at the clock. 2:17 a.m. exactly. For a few seconds, I just lay there, half asleep, trying to make sense of what had woken me. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. Then knock, knock, score, any knock. 3 slow knocks, not loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. I sat up immediately. Every explanation that went through my mind was perfectly ordinary. Another forestry worker, a ranger, maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost after dark. It wouldn't have been smart, but people do stupid things in the mountains all the time. I reached for the lantern on the bedside table and switched it on. The cabin filled with a warm yellow glow. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. My boots by the door, my jacket hanging from a hook, my survey map spread across the kitchen table. Nothing felt wrong. I walked to the front window first. Outside, nothing. Just darkness, the porch, the trees. A light breeze moving the branches. I couldn't see anyone. Still, if someone had knocked, I wasn't going to ignore them. I unlocked the front door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed inside. The porch was empty. I stepped outside. The lantern lit only a few meters ahead of me. Beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. Easily could have been a deer. I remember muttering to myself. I walked around the cabin anyway. Checked the water tank, the woodshed, the truck. Nothing. No voices, no footsteps, no flashlight moving through the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Cabins make noise, wood expands, branches scrape against walls. When you're tired enough, your brain fills in the blanks. I went back inside, locked the door, and somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next morning, the whole thing felt ridiculous. I made coffee, packed my gear, and spent another full day walking the survey route. By late afternoon, I'd already covered more ground than I'd expected. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, cool air. Exactly what you want when you're spending 10 hours climbing ridgelines. Every now and then, I'd think about the knocking, then I'd laugh at myself. I was 31 years old, I worked in forests for a living. If every strange noise scared me, I'd never get any work done. That evening, I checked in with the ranger station over the radio. "Everything going all right out there?" the dispatcher asked. "Couldn't be better," I said. "You getting any company?" I smiled. "Not unless the squirrels have started knocking." He laughed. "Told you it'd be quiet." "Quiet's good." It usually is. The radio crackled for a moment, then went silent. I cooked dinner, read a few pages of an old paperback I'd brought with me, fed another log into the stove. By 10:30, I was asleep again. I don't know what made me wake up the second night. This time, there weren't any knocks. Not at first. There was only silence. The kind that makes you realize you've been listening for something without even knowing it. I rolled over, opened one eye, and looked at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Then knock, knock, knock. I didn't move this time. I just lay there, watching the clock. 2:17 a.m. The lantern was still sitting on the bedside table. I reached over, switched it on, and waited. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no wind against the walls. Just the ticking of the old clock. I slipped out of bed, walked quietly into the kitchen, and stopped beside the front window. The porch was empty. The lantern reflected off the glass just enough that I had to cup my hand against it to see outside. Nothing. The trees stood perfectly still. I unlocked the door, opened it slowly, and listened. Cold air, dead silence. I stepped onto the porch. The forest looked exactly as it had the night before. Dark, quiet, ordinary. I even walked to the edge of the clearing and swept the lantern across the tree line. Nothing looked out of place. Eventually, I shook my head, laughed to myself, and went back inside. I remember thinking, whatever's making that noise, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been an animal. I made coffee, loaded my backpack, locked the cabin behind me, then stopped halfway down the porch steps. The ground was still damp from the rain that had passed through over the weekend, soft enough to leave clear impressions. There were boot prints, not mine. Mine were already drying near the truck. These were fresh. They came out of the trees, crossed the clearing, and stopped at the bottom step of the porch. I frowned, then I looked for the return prints. There weren't any. I checked twice, walked the entire edge of the clearing. Nothing. Just one line of muddy prints, ending at the porch. I stood there for a good minute trying to make sense of it. The most obvious explanation was that I'd missed something. Maybe the ground had dried in one direction. Maybe leaves had covered the other tracks. Maybe I'd simply overlooked them. So I got down on one knee, looked closer. The impressions were sharp. Heavy hiking boots, deep heel marks. Whoever made them had been carrying weight. I followed every print again. The last one ended less than a foot from the first porch step. After that, nothing. No scuff marks, no drag marks, no sign that anyone had turned around. I finally checked my watch. I was already running late. Reluctantly, I grabbed my camera and took a few photographs, not because I thought anything strange had happened, because odd things in the woods usually have ordinary explanations, and photographs help you remember details. The rest of the day should have distracted me. Instead, I found myself thinking about those prints every hour or so. I'd stop what I was doing and replay the scene in my head. By late afternoon, I'd almost talked myself out of it again. That evening, I checked in over the radio. The same dispatcher answered. "Everything's still quiet out there?" For the most part, there was a pause. "You sound tired." "I didn't sleep much." He chuckled. "Cabins will do that." "I guess." I hesitated, then asked, "Has anyone been working this section this week?" "No." "What about hikers?" "Trails closed until next month." I looked out the window toward the trees. "So nobody should be out here." Another short pause. "Not unless they ignored a lot of warning signs." That answer should have reassured me. Instead, it did the opposite, because I hadn't imagined those footprints, and somebody had walked right up to my cabin. I just couldn't explain how they'd left. That evening, I made a decision. If something really was coming to the cabin every night at 2:17, I wanted to be awake when it happened. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I just wanted an answer. After dinner, I lit the stove, filled my mug with coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my notebook. Every so often, I'd glance at the old wall clock, 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. The cabin felt different that night, not because anything had changed, but because I was waiting. Every little sound seemed louder. The stove creaked as the metal heated and cooled. Branches brushed against the roof. Somewhere outside, an owl called once, then everything went quiet again. By 2 o'clock, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. I stood up, walked a slow lap around the cabin, checked every window, locked the front door again, even though I'd already checked it twice. Then I sat back down. The second hand on the wall clock swept forward. 2:16. I found myself holding my breath. The room was completely still. Then, knock, knock, knock. Exactly 3. Exactly the same as before. I didn't move. For several seconds, I simply listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no voice, no movement on the porch. I picked up the lantern, walked quietly to the front window, and looked out. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond it was lit by a pale moon. Nothing moved. I waited another minute. Still nothing. Slowly, I stepped back from the window. That's when I heard it. "Ethan?" I froze. The voice wasn't loud. It wasn't whispered either. It sounded almost conversational, like someone standing just outside the door, close enough that they expected me to answer. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't speak. The cabin was silent again. I stayed exactly where I was, listening. A full minute passed, then another. Nothing. Eventually, I forced myself to the front door. I unlocked it, opened it. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. The tree line hadn't changed. I walked the entire perimeter of the cabin with the lantern. Nothing. No footprints. No fresh tracks. No sign that anyone had been there. I barely slept. By sunrise, I'd already decided. I'd finish the day's survey, drive back to the ranger station, and ask if there was another cabin I could use. I didn't care if it added an extra hour to the drive. I wasn't spending another night there. The survey itself went smoothly. If anything, I worked faster than usual. By late afternoon, I was packing my equipment into the truck. Before leaving, I walked back inside the cabin one last time to make sure I hadn't forgotten anything. My notebook, camera, radio, lantern, everything was there. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The bedroom window. I stepped closer. On the outside wall, directly beneath the window, were 3 long scratches in the timber, perfectly parallel. Fresh enough that pale wood showed beneath them. I reached out and ran my fingers across the grooves. They were deep. Far too deep to have been made by a tree branch. I stood there for a long time, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. I couldn't. For the first time all week, I locked the cabin, not to keep wildlife out, but because I wasn't sure what I was leaving behind. I climbed into the truck, turned the key. The engine clicked once, then nothing. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard. Then I tried the key again. Nothing, not even a slow crank, just a single click. The truck had never given me trouble before, not once. I climbed out, lifted the bonnet, and checked everything I knew how to check. Battery terminals, loose cables, fuel. Nothing looked wrong. I tried again. Click. I looked at my watch. Just after 6. There wasn't enough daylight left to hike back to the ranger station, and even if I started walking, I'd be covering unfamiliar mountain trails in the dark. That would have been far more dangerous than spending one more night in the cabin. So I unpacked my gear, lit the stove, and told myself I'd leave at first light. That evening felt different. Not because anything happened, but because nothing did. No strange noises, no uneasy feeling. The forest sounded almost normal again. By 10 o'clock, I started wondering if I'd worked myself into a state over nothing. Maybe the scratches had always been there. Maybe I'd missed the footprints. Maybe someone really had been passing through. One by one, every explanation I'd rejected started sounding reasonable again. I went to bed. For the first time in days, I slept. When I opened my eyes, the room was grey with early morning light. I reached for my watch. 6:11 a.m. I'd slept straight through the night. No knocking, no voices, nothing. I actually laughed. A quiet, embarrassed laugh. I remember thinking, you're going to feel pretty stupid when you tell this story one day. I got dressed, packed the last of my gear, slung my backpack over one shoulder, then reached for the bedroom door. Before my hand touched the handle, knock, knock, knock. 3 slow knocks on the other side of the bedroom door, inside the cabin. Every thought in my head stopped. The bedroom door opened into the kitchen. There was nobody else inside. I knew that. I'd locked the cabin myself. I stood there, unable to move. The knocks never came again. There was only silence. After what felt like several minutes, I forced myself to open the door. The kitchen was empty. The front door was still locked. Every window was still latched. Nothing had been disturbed. The cabin looked exactly as it always had. I didn't check another room. I didn't try to explain it. I picked up my bag, walked straight outside, and climbed into the truck. This time, the engine started instantly. I didn't question it. I just drove. About halfway back to the ranger station, the radio crackled to life. Ethan? It was the dispatcher. You heading back already? Yeah. Everything all right? I looked at the road ahead for a long moment before answering. Yeah. It was the easiest lie I'd ever told. I handed in my survey notes that afternoon, told them the job was finished. When they asked if I'd be available for another remote assignment before winter, I declined. A week later, I received the photographs I'd taken around the cabin. The footprints were there, every single one, leading from the tree line to the bottom step, exactly as I remembered. But something else caught my attention, something I'd somehow missed in the field. In the final photograph, the one I'd taken from the porch looking back toward the trees, there was a small wooden sign nailed to an old oak. I'd walked past it half a dozen times without noticing. The camera had captured it clearly. 3 words, do not answer. I still have that photograph. I've looked at it hundreds of times over the years. I've zoomed in, adjusted the brightness, even convinced myself the words were probably a trick of the light. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. I never went back to that cabin to find out. People ask why I refuse to stay alone in remote cabins now. The truth is, it isn't because of the knocking. It's because whoever was outside was polite enough to wait. And every now and then, usually just before I fall asleep, I wake up for no reason at all. I look at the clock, hoping it isn't 2:17. Then, without even thinking, I find myself listening for 3 slow knocks. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending part of your night with me. If you enjoyed tonight's story, I'd really appreciate it if you left a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing these stories to life. And if you've ever experienced something you still can't explain, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Until next time, stay safe, sleep well, and I'll see you again after dark.